Rain slammed the windshield as she turned the corner, headlights catching a pair of terrified eyes locked in place beside a rusted fence. She had been driving home later than usual, the streets mostly empty, and the storm turning everything into a blur of grey and silver. She almost missed it that moment, the glint of eyes, not reflecting like a street sign or puddle but alive, wide and frozen in fear. Something in her chest tightened. She slowed the car, rolled down her window despite the downpour, and squinted through the streaking water. It was a dog, big but thin, standing stiff in the grass, his body pressed against a fence, as though trying to disappear from the world around him. Her wipers squeaked once more, and she saw the chain wrapped tightly around his neck, leading to a rusted pole stuck in the ground. No shelter, no food, no movement, except a barely visible rise and fall of his chest. She pulled over quickly, tires slipping slightly on the wet road. Her hand hesitated on the door handle. The rain was coming down hard, but she didn't care anymore. Her instincts had already made the decision the moment their eyes met. Stepping out, she was hit by a wall of wind and cold, but she moved toward the dog slowly, carefully, not wanting to scare him away. Though the chain clearly ensured he had nowhere to run, his ears were back, tail tucked completely underneath, and legs stiff with fear. He was soaked all the way through, fur clinging to his ribs, making him look even more fragile than he already did. His eyes followed her every move, not with aggression, but the kind of fear that spoke of betrayal and pain. She stopped a few feet away, crouched low, letting the rain soak her completely. She spoke softly, her voice nearly lost in the sound of a storm. But she kept going anyway, hoping he could sense her calm through the panic. She could see him shaking from more than the cold, his legs trembling, his breath shallow. She reached into her coat pocket, slowly pulling out a protein bar, the only food she had with her, and unwrapped it with careful fingers. The scent caught his attention just enough that his nose lifted slightly. Still, his body stayed frozen, as though any sudden movement might invite more harm. She set the bar down in the wet grass between them, then backed up slowly, sitting in the mud, her eyes never leaving his. He waited 1 minute, then 2, then 5, before creeping forward, each step cautious and ready to bolt, his eyes never leaving her. Even as he leaned down and took the food in his mouth, he chewed slowly, then swallowed, standing in the same place, as if unsure what to do next. She didn't move, she just sat there, letting the rain pour over both of them, until finally, after what felt like forever, he took one shaky step closer, his tail still tucked, his eyes still filled with doubt, but his feet pointed in her direction, and it was enough to make her breathe for the first time since she stopped the car. Soaked and shivering, the German shepherd stood chained to a post, its ribs visible through matted fur as thunder cracked across the sky. She stayed crouched in the rain, her clothes heavy, her fingers numb, but she could not walk away. Something about the way the dog stood there, silent and trembling, struck her deeper than anything she had felt in years. He did not bark, he did not growl, he did not even try to pull away from the chain that dug into his neck. He simply stood, as though he had already accepted that no one was coming, that no one would care, that he was meant to be forgotten in this corner of the world, hidden behind weeds and garbage bins. She slowly reached into her bag, this time pulling out a bottle of water, and poured it into a small plastic container she found under the seat of her car, sliding it gently along the ground toward him. He did not move at first, then his nose twitched once, twice, and after a moment he stepped forward, his body shaking with effort and fear, each movement stiff, like he had not walked in days. He lowered his head and lapped the water quickly, then stopped again, retreating as if afraid he would be punished for even that small act of survival. She looked around, trying to understand who had left him here. The fence belonged to an old warehouse, long abandoned, the windows broken, the doors chained shut. The chain around his neck was thick, rusted, old, like it had been used for other animals before. Maybe this was not the first, maybe no one ever noticed because no one ever came down this road in weather like this. Maybe that was the plan all along, to leave him in a place where no one would hear him cry, where no one would see him waste away in the rain. Her throat burned and her hands clenched, but she took a breath, forcing herself to stay calm, for him, not for herself. Her anger would not help him now. She leaned back, resting on her heels, watching him watch her, his eyes darker now, less wide, less panicked, but still unsure, still waiting to see if this kindness would turn cruel like it had before. She wondered how many times he had been tricked, how many voices had called to him softly before hurting him, how many hands had reached out only to strike when he let his guard down. The rain kept falling, soaking them both. But she did not move, she sat there quietly, and he stood there silently, two souls trapped by something bigger than a chain or a storm. Slowly, slowly, his legs began to relax just slightly, and for the first time, his ears moved forward, not flat, not fearful, just curious, a tiny shift, but a signal, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, he did not want to be alone in this cold world anymore, and maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to believe she would not hurt him. That night she left only when the sky turned black, and the lightning stopped, not because she wanted to, but because he needed time to see that she would return. And as she walked back to her car, her heart felt heavier and fuller all at once, knowing she could never forget those eyes or the promise they silently begged her to keep. Her heart pounded as she stepped from the car, cold water running into her boots, while the dog growled low, uncertain whether to fight or flee. But she did not flinch, did not retreat. She simply stood still, one hand holding the same container of food she had brought the night before, the other hanging loosely at her side, showing him she had nothing to hurt him with. The growl was not aggressive, it was wounded, it was tired, it was the sound of an animal who had been taught not to trust, but who wanted to so badly that it hurt. He stared at her again, those same dark eyes like two storm clouds, full of questions and warnings and flickers of something she could only describe as hope. She took one step forward, slowly, deliberately, her boots sinking slightly in the mud, and she placed the food closer than before, a little nearer to his paws. This time then she backed away again and sat down on the wet pavement, rain dripping from her hair, her arms, her nose, as she waited without speaking, without forcing anything, just letting him come to his own decision. He stood still for several minutes, unmoving except for the slight twitch of his tail and the rise and fall of his chest. Then at last he stepped forward and ate again, slower this time, as if not as desperate, as if the food was less about survival now and more about connection. She watched every bite, every swallow, every movement, and when he finished, he looked at her not with fear this time, but with something softer, something she could not name yet, but it made her chest ache. She reached into her coat and pulled out the dry towel she had brought, holding it out with both hands. The dog lowered his head a little, his ears twitching, but he did not growl, he did not move away. He only watched as she inched closer on her knees, slowly across the mud and grass, until she was near enough to reach him with the towel. She stretched out her arm gently, barely brushing against his side, and he flinched but did not run. His body quivered under her touch, but he stayed there, still standing, still watching her. She wiped his fur with light, careful motions, the towel soaking up the cold rain and dirt from his matted coat, and for the first time he closed his eyes, not fully, not in surrender, but in something like relief, like he had waited so long for someone to treat him like this, to care even just a little. Her hands moved slowly, patiently, never forcing anything, and though his body was tense, every muscle locked in a lifetime of fear, he allowed her to keep going, to clean him, to comfort him, even if he did not yet understand why. When she finished, she stood up slowly and looked down at him, the towel heavy in her hands, the rain easing into a soft mist around them. He looked up at her, uncertain and tired, but no longer backing away. She gave him one last look, a silent promise, and turned to leave, but he did something that stopped her in her tracks. He took one step forward, then another, the chain pulling tight around his neck, holding him back, but he did not bark or cry. He simply stared, as if to say, "Please come back tomorrow." She knelt in the mud, arms outstretched, whispering gently, until the dog inched forward, hunger and desperation stronger than fear. His eyes locked on hers, every step unsure and trembling, but he kept moving, the chain tugging lightly with each motion, as though reminding him not to trust too much, not to hope too fast. She stayed still, barely breathing, watching his ribs expand and contract with shallow breaths, his paws sinking into the soft ground as the rain turned to drizzle, the wind dying down, leaving only the sound of her voice and the quiet rhythm of his steps. When his nose finally touched her hand, she did not move. Instead, she let him sniff her skin soaking wet, and cold, his breath hot and uneven against her fingers. He smelled like rust and dirt, and something odor, something worn out like sadness, soaked into his fur. She whispered again, saying his name, though she did not know it yet, saying gentle words that had no meaning except the tone, the softness, the absence of threat. And for the first time his tail twitched, not wagging, just a small uncertain flick that said he wanted to believe her. She stayed there for what felt like hours, the sky growing darker, the air colder, but she could not leave, not now, not after he had come so far. He sat down, suddenly collapsing into the mud with a heavy sigh, his legs folding beneath him as if they had finally given up, or maybe finally relaxed. And she moved closer, inch by inch, her hands still open, the towel still in her lap, until she was right beside him, and he let her place it over his back, pressing down just enough to warm him without making him feel trapped. His body shivered again, not from fear this time, but from release, like something inside had cracked and started to melt, and she saw the first tear in her own eyes, not because she was sad, but because she knew in that moment he had decided to let her in, not completely, not yet, but enough to stay, enough to try, and that was everything she had hoped for. She stayed with him until the last light faded from the sky, until the street lights buzzed on in the distance, and then she whispered that she would come back tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, as many times as it took. She left, slowly backing away so he would not feel abandoned, walking backward through the mud until she reached her car, her hands trembling not from the cold but from the weight of what had just happened. She sat behind the wheel for a long time, watching him through the glass as he lay back down, head on his paws, eyes following her every move, but not with panic anymore, with something quieter, something steadier, maybe even trust. That night she could not sleep. She kept seeing those eyes every time she closed hers, wide and dark and tired, but still alive, still full of the smallest flicker of hope. And she made a decision as the rain returned, tapping softly against her window. She would not wait for someone else to help. She would be the one to save him, no matter what it took. For 2 nights she returned with food and dry towels, watching from a distance as the bond between them began to form in silence and storm. Each time she came, he was already waiting, standing near the fence, not wagging his tail, not barking, but watching calmly, as if he knew she would come back, as if part of him had started to count on it. She no longer stayed in the car. Now she walked directly to him, speaking softly, holding out his meal in both hands, placing it near his paws, before sitting beside him, never too close, always just near enough to let him decide what he was ready for. By the 3rd night he greeted her with a quiet sound, not a growl, not a bark, something in between, a low soft note like a sigh that said he had begun to recognize her, and that recognition lit something inside her, something powerful and quiet, that reminded her how far trust could reach if given time. She still saw the fear in his eyes, the stiffness in his legs, the way he flinched at sudden noises, but she also saw change, small things like the way his body no longer turned away when she reached out, or the way his ears perked when he heard her voice. That night she sat with him for over an hour, sharing pieces of bread and bits of leftover chicken from her own dinner, wrapped in a napkin kept warm in her coat pocket. She talked to him about nothing and everything, her words, not meant to be understood, just fell stories about her job, about the people she passed on the street, about how she used to have a dog as a child, and how that dog had been her best friend through the quietest years of her life. And she realized then that she missed having someone to come home to, someone who waited not because they had to, but because they wanted to. She knew the chain had to come off. She could not keep walking away from him night after night, knowing he was still trapped, still exposed, still at the mercy of the cold and rain. So she made a call to animal control, hoping someone would come and do what needed to be done. But no one answered. She left messages, explained the situation, gave the location, described the condition of the dog, and still no reply, not that night, not the next day, not even the one after that. And with every passing hour, her worry grew stronger. On the 4th night, she came back not with food, but with boat cutters borrowed from her neighbor, her hands shaking as she approached the fence. The dog stood up when he saw her, his eyes alert, but no longer afraid. As she knelt beside him, tools in hand, she whispered again, saying it was time, saying he had to be brave one more time. And he did not run, he did not back away. He stood still while she cut the chain, and when the last piece snapped loose with a dull metallic pop, he blinked slowly as if unsure what freedom even felt like. She led him to her car door open blanket already laid across the seat, and he hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside, curling into a ball, still dripping, still unsure, but finally safe. And as she drove away from that place, she reached over and laid her hand on his back, whispering gently, "You are coming home now." With the help of a friend, she legally adopted the dog, naming him Max, and slowly earned his trust through daily walks, quiet evenings, and patience. The first night in her apartment, he paced the living room for hours, nose to the floor, tail low, ears shifting at every sound, as if searching for the danger he believed must be hiding in the corners. He would not eat unless she left the room, and he would not lie down unless the door was open and the lights were on, so she left them that way. She sat on the floor nearby, pretending to read, but really just waiting to see if he would sleep. By morning, he had not closed his eyes, but he had stopped pacing, and that felt like a start. She called her friend who worked with rescue animals and asked for advice. They told her what she already knew, that trust was slow, that healing was not a straight line, and that she would have to be the most stable thing in his world until he realized he was not in danger anymore. So she made him a schedule. She kept his food in the same place, walked the same route at the same time, every day spoke to him with the same tone, used the same words, always calm, always clear, always gentle. Little by little, Max began to change. The first time he wagged his tail, it was so subtle, she almost missed it, a soft, hesitant sway. When she came home from the store, he stood near the door, ears high, eyes watching her every move. And when she bent down to greet him, he leaned forward, sniffing her face before sitting at her feet, not touching but closer than before. She wanted to cry, but instead she just smiled and whispered, "Good boy," and his eyes softened like he understood exactly what that meant. The first time he let her brush his fur was 2 weeks later. She brought the brush out, slowly sat down on the rug, and waited. He sniffed it, walked away, came back, and finally lowered himself beside her, his side pressed against her knee, and she worked gently through the knots and dirt, speaking softly the whole time, telling him how handsome he was, how strong, how brave, and with every stroke she could feel the tension leaving his body, like he had been waiting for this his whole life and never believed it would come. At night he started sleeping beside the couch head, resting near her feet, sometimes snoring softly, sometimes twitching like he was still running through his past in his dreams. And she would reach down without thinking, let her fingers find his fur, and he would settle again, a soft sigh escaping, as if to say, "I am still learning, but I think I am safe now." The neighbors began to notice. Two people who had seen him before, chained and broken, now saw a tall, proud shepherd walking calmly at her side, alert but not afraid, strong but not aggressive, curious but never reckless. And every time someone commented on how beautiful he was, she smiled and said, "He is not just beautiful, he is a survivor." Months passed, and Max transformed from a terrified, broken animal into a loyal, joyful companion who never left her side. Every morning he waited by the door, ready for their walk, his tail wagging, his eyes alert, no longer scanning the world for threats, but for squirrels and morning joggers and the occasional cat that darted across their path. He walked beside her, not behind, not ahead, matching her steps, as if they had been doing this for years, as if he had never known a life of chains and fear and cold rain. He had a favorite spot in the park under a wide oak tree where the sun broke through the branches and turned his dark fur golden, and she would sit there with him every weekend, a book in her hand and his head resting on her lap, the wind in the leaves, the smell of grass, the quiet hum of a world that had started to feel like home again, not just for her but for him too. He began to greet people with cautious interest, sometimes a sniff, sometimes a soft bark, but never fear, not anymore, not since he learned that kindness could come without pain. She watched him grow stronger, his body filling out, muscles returning, his coat thick and shiny, his posture proud. He had started to play again, chasing after sticks, rolling in the grass, making strange barking sounds that were almost like laughter. And the first time he ran in a full circle around her, tail flying, legs stretching wide, mouth open in what could only be called joy. She clapped her hands and called his name, and he came running back to her faster than ever, burying his face in her coat as if to say, "This is mine, this life is mine now." At home, he had his favorite places: the rug by the heater, the pillow in the corner, the edge of the bed where he sometimes slept when the night felt long, and she never told him no, not once, not when he had spent so many nights in the rain alone and forgotten. He followed her from room to room, not out of anxiety, but because he simply wanted to be near her, whether she was cooking or reading or folding laundry. He would lie nearby, watching, content to exist in the same space, to know she was there. He started to recognize words, not just his name, but simple things like walk or outside or dinner, and whenever she said good boy, his ears perked up, and he would come closer, pressing his head into her chest, as if trying to become part of her, to remind her that he was there, that he remembered, that he was grateful in his own quiet way. One evening she had a nightmare and woke up with tears on her face, and Max was already there, pressed against her side, his eyes wide and alert and calm, like he knew how it felt to wake up scared and alone. She realized then that he was not just her dog, he was her friend, her protector, her reminder that sometimes the most broken things do not stay broken, and that love was not always something loud or sudden. Sometimes it was built slowly through moments and silence and steady presence. Sometimes it came with muddy paws and old scars and eyes that had seen too much and still chose to trust again. People at work asked her what had changed. They said she smiled more now, that she seemed lighter, and she always thought of Max in those moments of the first night. She saw him chained and shivering, and how far they had come together. She would answer softly, saying, "I brought someone home, and he brought me back to life," without anyone noticing the difference he made just by existing beside her. And every evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows on the walls, he would come to her, lay his head on her knee, and close his eyes, and she would place a hand on his back, her fingers brushing over the scars that no longer defined him, and she would whisper the same thing she had whispered the day she set him free: "You are safe, you are loved, you are home now." That one act of kindness not only saved Max, but gave her a sense of purpose and love that filled a space in her heart she didn't know was empty. Each morning when she opened her eyes, he was there, his head resting gently at the side of the bed, his tail wagging slowly, as if he knew that every day together was a gift. She did not need an alarm anymore. His presence was enough, his calm, steady gaze telling her that no matter what else changed in the world, this bond between them was something she could rely on. They had become inseparable, not because of fear or dependence, but because they had chosen each other again and again, through each moment, through each test, through each quiet day that built a foundation no storm could wash away. She talked to him now like he was part of her thoughts, like he understood the things she couldn't always say to anyone else, and in a way he did, not through language, but through presence, through the way he followed her moods, the way he came close when she was quiet or rested his head in her lap when she was tired. There were still reminders of the life he came from: loud noises still made him jump, sudden movements in the street made him pause, but instead of freezing in fear, he looked to her now for reassurance, for direction, and she gave it with a single word or a nod or a touch of her hand. He had learned that the world could be unpredictable, but not all of it was cruel, and she had learned that healing did not always look perfect, but it always looked real. One afternoon, a neighbor knocked on her door, holding a tiny trembling puppy they had found abandoned near the train tracks, and they remembered she had a dog and thought maybe she would know what to do. Max stood behind her, watching as she gently picked up the puppy, who could not stop shaking, and something passed between the two dogs, a quiet recognition, and without hesitation, Max walked forward, sniffed the puppy once, and then laid down beside him, not claiming, not guarding, just accepting. And in that moment, she knew Max had truly let go of his old life. She kept the puppy too, named her Lily, and slowly Max took on the role of teacher, protector, older brother. He showed her where the food was, how to ask for the door, how to chase butterflies, and when to curl up in the sun. And as Lily grew stronger, more playful, more confident, Max remained steady and proud, watching her as if seeing his own journey mirrored in hers, only this time from the other side. Sometimes she would take them both to the place where she first found him, though the fence was long gone and the warehouse nearly torn down. She would sit with Max and Lily in the grass, remembering that night with the rain and the fear and the way his eyes looked at her through the dark, like he was asking for one more chance, and she would run her fingers through his fur and whisper thank you, not just for surviving, not just for trusting, but for changing her life in ways she'd never expected. Years passed and the seasons turned, and Max grew slower, his face turning gray, his steps more careful. But his spirit remained full of grace and calm, and she adjusted their routines for him, shorter walks, softer beds, more time in the sun. And when they walked together, Lily running ahead, Max still stayed beside her, their pace slower, but still in rhythm, as if nothing had really changed. The day he finally closed his eyes for the last time, he was not alone, he was not in the rain, he was not chained or afraid, he was wrapped in a blanket on her lap, her voice in his ears, her hands on his chest, telling him he was a good boy, that he was loved, that he could rest now. And when he took his last breath, it was not with fear, but with peace. And though her heart broke, she knew it was whole too, because loving him had made her stronger, braver, kinder. And as Lily curled up beside her that night, she whispered the same words once more: you are safe, you are loved, you are home.